Sometimes the hardest choices in life are the ones that define who we truly are. In a world where duty comes before heart, one moment of unexpected kindness can change everything. In the Viking highlands, warrior Kolbrand waited for his arranged bride, Thora. When her wagon arrived, she stepped down with her two orphaned twin sisters. Everyone expected him to send the girls away. After all, his marriage contract was for one bride, not 3 mouths to feed through the harsh winter. Thora prepared to say goodbye to Inga and Idun forever. But when Kolbrand looked at the 3 sisters standing together in the snow, he made a choice that stunned everyone. 4 simple words that would change their lives. They stay with you. What happened next in that mountain stronghold would challenge every tradition the clan had ever known. But how could one act of mercy survive when a rival clan threatened to tear this newfound family apart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain stronghold of Orphaned stood like a weathered giant against the winter sky, its stone walls carved from the living rock of the mountainside itself. Snow clung to every surface, transforming the fortress into something that seemed born of ice and ancient dreams. From the great hall's narrow windows, one could see for leagues across the valley below, where smaller settlements dotted the landscape like scattered coins on a vast white cloth. Kolbrand had built this place with his own hands, aided by warriors who had followed him through campaigns that now lived only in whispered stories. The great hall stretched nearly 60 paces from end to end, its vaulted ceiling supported by massive timber beams hewn from trees that had stood when his grandfather's grandfather was young. Above the central hearth, where flames danced and crackled against the mountain cold, hung his war hammer, a weapon of such size and weight that few men could lift it, let alone wield it in battle. The hammer had earned him his reputation across the northern clans. Kolbrand the Giant, they called him, though his true height was perhaps no more than 7 feet. It was not merely his physical presence that earned the name, but the way he filled any space he entered, the quiet authority that made even seasoned warriors step aside when he passed. His beard, now touched with silver at the temples, had been dark as a raven's wing when he first took up that hammer and carved his legend across a dozen battlefields. But legends, Kolbrand had learned, were cold comfort on winter nights. He stood now in the great hall's central space, watching the last embers of the evening fire settle into glowing coals. The marriage contract lay spread across the oak table before him, its parchment yellowed with age and marked with the seals of both clans. The agreement was simple. Enough a union between himself and Thora, daughter of Jarl Eriksson, to seal the peace between their peoples after years of border disputes and cattle raids that had cost both sides too much blood and treasure. It was a practical arrangement, negotiated by clan elders who understood that survival in these mountains required strength through unity. At 43, Kolbrand had resigned himself to a life without the companionship of a true partner. His first wife, Astrid, had died in childbirth 15 years ago, taking their unborn son with her. Since then, he had thrown himself into warfare and the building of his stronghold, creating a place of safety for his people, but living within it like a man trapped in his own fortress. The sound of wagon wheels on frozen ground had echoed through the valley that afternoon, announcing the arrival of his bride-to-be. He had watched from the battlements as the small procession wound its way up the mountain path, a single covered wagon flanked by half a dozen mounted guards. The sight had stirred something in him that he had thought long dead, not excitement. Exactly. But a kind of cautious hope that perhaps this arrangement might bring something more than mere political convenience to his life. Thora had stepped down from the wagon with the grace of a woman accustomed to hardship. Even from a distance, he could see the practical set of her shoulders, the way she took in her surroundings with clear, assessing eyes. She was not beautiful in the way of the shield maidens of legend, but there was something in her bearing that spoke of inner strength, of someone who had learned to carry burdens without complaint. And then the twins had emerged. Inga and Idun, barely 18 summers by the look of them, moved with the unconscious synchronization of those who had shared the world since birth. But where Thora carried herself with the weight of responsibility, the twins still held traces of innocence that the harsh northern winters had not yet worn away. They stood close to their elder sister, their eyes wide as they took in the massive stone walls and the armed warriors who had gathered in the courtyard. The marriage contract made no mention of additional family members. Eric Stormcrow, his chief counselor, had immediately voiced the obvious concern. "The agreement is for one bride, Lord. We cannot be expected to provide for, I can read." Kolbrand had replied quietly, his eyes never leaving the three sisters. There was something in the way they stood together, a unity that spoke of shared trials and mutual protection. He recognized it because he had seen it among warriors who had fought side by side, who had learned that survival depended on absolute trust in those beside you. Thora had begun to speak, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard despite the mountain wind. She spoke of her sister's circumstances, orphaned when raiders had struck their settlement 2 years ago, dependent on her care since their parents' death. She explained, with the dignity of someone who had learned to ask for nothing while giving everything, that she had hoped to find them places as servants in Kolbrand's household, that they would work for their keep and cause no trouble. The practical solution would have been to send them away. Winter stores were carefully calculated, and 2 additional mouths to feed could mean the difference between plenty and hunger when the spring thaw finally came. The clan's acceptance of this marriage had been hard-won, negotiated through months of careful diplomacy. Adding complications would give his critics within the clan council ammunition to question his judgment. But as Kolbrand had looked at the three sisters Thora's protective stance, the twins' brave attempt to hide their fear, he had seen something that the marriage contract and clan politics could not account for. He saw family. Not the bloodline kind that came with titles and inheritance, but the chosen kind, forged in adversity and maintained through loyalty. "They stay with you," he had said, and the words had carried across the courtyard like a declaration of war against convention. The reaction had been immediate. Eric Stormcrow's weathered face had darkened with concern. Several of the younger warriors had exchanged glances that spoke of doubts about their lord's wisdom. Even some of the household servants had whispered among themselves, calculating the extra work that 3 women would bring to an already demanding mountain existence. But Kolbrand had built his reputation on decisive action, and he had learned long ago that leadership sometimes meant making choices that others would question until events proved their wisdom. He watched as understanding dawned in Thora's eyes, followed by something that might have been gratitude, though she was too proud to let it show plainly. The twins had simply stared, as if they couldn't quite believe that their desperate hope for a new beginning had been answered by 4 simple words from a giant warrior they had never met. That evening, as the household settled into the routines that had governed life in Grafenbrecke for years, Kolbrand found himself considering what he had set in motion. The great hall, which had echoed with emptiness for so many years, now held the sound of feminine voices discussing sleeping arrangements and the location of the kitchens. It was a small change, but after 15 years of solitude, even small changes felt momentous. Thora had adapted to her new circumstances with the practical efficiency he had glimpsed in the courtyard. She had spoken with the head cook about meal preparations, inquired about the household's winter routines, and begun the delicate process of establishing her place in a community that was not quite ready to accept her. There was no pretense about love or romance in her manner. She approached their marriage as the practical arrangement it was, but with a dignity that commanded respect. The twins presented a different challenge. Inga, the more outgoing of the two, had already charmed the stable master with her obvious knowledge of horses and her willingness to work alongside the men without complaint. Idun, quieter and more observant, had gravitated toward the household's elderly healer, asking careful questions about the herbs and remedies that kept the clan healthy through the harsh mountain winters. But for every small success, there were reminders of the delicate balance that Kolbrand's decision had disturbed. During the evening meal, he had noticed the pointed looks from some of the clan's senior members, the way conversations fell silent when the sisters passed. Change, even positive change, was never welcomed easily by those who had grown comfortable with established ways. As the fire died down to embers and the great hall emptied, Kolbrand remained at the oak table, studying the marriage contract by the flickering light. The parchment represented duty, tradition, the careful preservation of peace through calculated alliance. But across the room, he could hear the quiet murmur of the three sisters talking together in the small chamber that had been prepared for Thora, and their voices represented something else entirely, the messy, complicated, infinitely more meaningful bonds that held real families together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The clan council would want explanations. The household would need to adjust its routines to accommodate 3 new members instead of 1. And somewhere beyond his mountain stronghold, rival clans would be watching to see if Kolbrand's unexpected act of mercy might be interpreted as weakness. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, the great hall of Grafenbrecker did not feel empty. Outside, the mountain wind howled against the stone walls, carrying the promise of deeper winter to come. Inside, a fire that had been carefully banked would burn through the night, keeping the cold at bay and warming a household that had suddenly, unexpectedly, become something more like a home. The first week at Grafenbrecker passed like a carefully choreographed dance, where everyone knew their steps, but no one was certain of the music. Thora moved through her new role with quiet determination, learning the rhythms of a household that had functioned without a lady's guidance for 15 years. The twins shadowed her during the days, helping where they could, while trying to make themselves useful without getting underfoot. It was Inga who first stirred real controversy. On the 4th morning, she had risen before dawn and made her way to the stables, where she found the stablemaster struggling with a mare that had been refusing to eat. The horse was valuable, a gift from a neighboring clan, but her pregnancy had made her temperamental and difficult to handle. "May I try?" Inga had asked, her voice soft but confident. Old Henrik, who had been managing the clan's horses for 30 years, had looked at the slip of a girl with undisguised skepticism. But something in her manner, perhaps the way she approached the mare without fear or hesitation, made him step aside. Within moments, Inga had the horse calm and eating from her hand. By the end of the week, she had reorganized the entire stable system with an efficiency that left Henrik both impressed and slightly defensive about his own methods. The controversy came when Eric Stormcrow discovered that one of the marriage bride's sisters was spending her days working alongside the men in what had always been considered unsuitable work for women of any standing. "It reflects poorly on the clan," Eric had argued during a tense conversation in Kolbrand's private chamber. "A bride's sister doing stable work makes us look as if we cannot provide properly for our lord's family." Kolbrand had listened patiently to the complaints, watching through his chamber window as Inga led a string of horses through the courtyard with the natural grace of someone born to the work. "She is useful," he said finally. "Henrik tells me she has improved the care of the animals. Useful skills should be valued, regardless of who possesses them." But Eric's concerns reflected a deeper unease that was spreading through the clan like ice forming on a pond. The arrangement with the sisters was unprecedented, and precedent mattered deeply to people whose survival depended on the stability of established ways. The tension came to a head during the clan's weekly assembly, held in the great hall on the 7th day after the sisters' arrival. What should have been a routine discussion of winter preparations and clan business became something closer to a trial. Gunnar Ironarm, one of the clan's most respected elders, stood to address the assembly with the formal dignity that marked important pronouncements. His weathered face bore the scars of decades of warfare, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of hard-won experience. "Lord Kolbrand," Gunnar began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "we have served you faithfully through many seasons, and you have led us with wisdom and strength. But this decision to house and feed additional mouths through the winter mouths that were not part of the marriage agreement put strain on resources that were calculated for specific numbers. A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled clan members. Kolbrand could see heads nodding, particularly among the younger warriors who had not yet earned the prosperity that came with successful raids and careful planning. Thora sat in the place of honor beside Kolbrand's chair, her mother's silver brooch catching the firelight as she maintained perfect composure despite the obvious challenge to her family's place. The brooch, a delicate piece of worked silver in the shape of interwoven knots, was one of the few things of value she had brought from her father's house, a reminder of the family bonds that had shaped her life. The winter stores, Gunnar continued, were carefully measured. Every pound of grain, every preserved fish, every cask of mead was calculated to see us through to spring. Adding 2 more to that count without adjusting the stores puts the entire clan at risk. Eric Stormcrow stood to add his voice to the concern. There is also the matter of precedent, Lord. If we begin making exceptions to formal agreements, what message does that send to other clans? What happens when they arrive with their own additional family members expecting the same generosity? The criticism was measured and respectful, but it was criticism nonetheless. Kolbrand could feel the weight of expectation in the hall, the clan's need for their leader to provide logical justification for what many saw as an impulsive decision driven by sentiment rather than wisdom. Before Kolbrand could respond, Thora rose from her chair. The hall fell silent as she stepped forward, her bearing dignified despite the obvious difficulty of her position. "Honored elders," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I understand your concerns and I share them. When I agreed to this marriage, I knew I was joining a clan that values strength and practical wisdom. I did not expect my lord husband to take on burdens that were not part of our agreement." She paused, her hand unconsciously touching the silver brooch at her shoulder. "But I also know that my sisters are not merely burdens to be fed. Inga has already improved the care of your horses in ways that will benefit the clan through many seasons. Idun has knowledge of healing herbs that could save lives when the mountain fever comes with the deep winter." Her words carried conviction, but Kolbrand could see the doubt in many faces. Promises of future usefulness meant little when weighed against the immediate reality of limited winter stores. "I offer this," Thora continued, her voice growing stronger. "Let my sisters prove their worth through this winter. If they cannot contribute enough to justify the food they consume, I will send them away when the spring roads open, regardless of my personal feelings." The offer sent a shock through the hall. It was a remarkable sacrifice, a woman offering to break apart her own family to preserve her new clan's resources. But it was also a challenge, a statement of confidence in her sister's abilities that demanded respect. Kolbrand studied the faces around the hall, reading the mix of admiration and skepticism in the clan's response to Thora's words. These were people who understood sacrifice, who had made countless hard choices to survive in the unforgiving mountain country. Thora's offer spoke to values they respected, even if they remained doubtful about the wisdom of his original decision. "The offer is noted," Kolbrand said finally, rising to his full height. "But it will not be necessary." His words carried the finality that ended discussions, but he could see that the matter was far from settled in the minds of many clan members. As the assembly broke up into smaller groups discussing clan business, he noticed the way some voices lowered when speaking of the sisters, the careful glances cast in Thora's direction. That evening, after the hall had emptied and the household had settled into sleep, Kolbrand found Thora sitting alone by the banked fire, staring into the glowing embers with the expression of someone wrestling with difficult thoughts. "You did not need to make such an offer," he said, settling into the chair beside her. She looked up at him with eyes that reflected both gratitude and worry. "They are my responsibility," she said simply. "They have been since our parents died. I will not see them become a source of division in your clan. And if they prove themselves, what then?" A small smile touched her lips, the first truly warm expression he had seen from her since her arrival. "Then your clan will be stronger for having them, and you will be known as a lord who values worth over convention." Outside, the wind carried the sound of snow beginning to fall, the first heavy snowfall that would mark the beginning of the true winter isolation. But inside the great hall, beside the warmth of the fire, Kolbrand found himself thinking that perhaps his impulsive decision might prove wiser than his critics imagined. The real test, he knew, was yet to come. The ancient loom in the women's quarter had stood silent for 15 years, its wooden frame gathering dust in the corner where Kolbrand's first wife had once spent her winter evenings. The intricate weaving apparatus, carved with protective runes and worn smooth by generations of women's hands, had seemed like a monument to loss, until Thora discovered it on her second week in the stronghold. "It's beautiful work," she had murmured, running her fingers along the carved supports. The loom was clearly the creation of master craftsmen, its frame decorated with intertwining patterns that seemed to tell stories of their own. Within days, she had cleaned and restored the mechanism, and soon the rhythmic sound of weaving filled the women's quarter for the first time since Astrid's death. But Thora had not claimed the loom for herself alone. Instead, she had drawn her sisters into the work, teaching them the complex patterns that would create cloth, both beautiful and practical for the clan's needs. It was around the loom that the three sisters found their rhythm in the household, their voices blending in quiet conversation as their hands moved in practiced coordination. Inga would work the spinning wheel, her natural dexterity with horses translating surprisingly well to the delicate task of creating even thread. Idun prepared the dyes, using her growing knowledge of mountain plants to create colors that had not been seen in Hrafnbrekka for years. The work they produced exceeded anything the clan had expected. The cloth that emerged from their combined efforts was of such quality that even the household's most critical servants had to admit its value. Heavy woolen fabric for winter cloaks, fine linen for the high table, intricate tapestries that would hang in the great hall. Each piece demonstrated skills that spoke of proper training and genuine talent. Old Sigrid, who had managed the household's domestic affairs since before Kolbrand's birth, watched the sisters work with the grudging approval of someone who valued competence above all else. "The young ones have good hands," she admitted to the kitchen staff, though she was careful to add, "We shall see if they maintain such standards when the work becomes routine." But it was not just their domestic skills that began to change the household's opinion. Each sister found ways to contribute that went beyond simple labor, demonstrating the kind of practical intelligence that mountain life demanded. Inga's work with the horses had evolved beyond simple, stable maintenance. She had begun training the younger animals with techniques that Henrik had never seen, but quickly recognized as superior to his own methods. Her understanding of horse behavior seemed intuitive, and under her guidance, several previously difficult animals became reliable mounts for the clan's scouts and messengers. "She speaks to them," Henrik told Kolbrand one afternoon, watching Inga work with a stallion that had been considered too aggressive for normal use. "Not with words, you understand, but something deeper. The beasts trust her in ways they trust few others." Kolbrand had observed this himself, watching from the great hall's windows as Inga moved among the horses with easy confidence. There was something almost mystical in the way she calmed nervous animals or coaxed performance from reluctant ones. Such skill was rare and valuable, particularly in a clan whose survival often depended on the speed and reliability of their mounts. Idun's contributions were quieter but no less significant. She had quickly established herself as an assistant to Ragnhild, the clan's elderly healer, learning not just the properties of familiar herbs, but seeking out mountain plants that the older woman had never considered for medicinal use. Her curiosity and careful observation had already led to improvements in several common remedies. "The child has the gift," Ragnhild confided to Kolbrand during one of their regular discussions about the clan's health. "She sees connections that escape others, understands the balance between different herbs. Give her time, and she may surpass even my knowledge." Such praise from Ragnhild carried particular weight, as the old healer was known for her skeptical nature and reluctance to train anyone. She considered unworthy of the responsibility that came with knowledge of life and death. As the days shortened and winter deepened its hold on the mountains, the household began to settle into new routines that included the sisters as integral parts rather than temporary additions. The evening meals in the Great Hall developed a different character, with conversation that ranged beyond the usual topics of weather, warfare, and clan politics. Thora proved particularly adept at drawing out the quieter members of the household, encouraging stories from the older warriors and creating an atmosphere where even the youngest servants felt comfortable sharing their thoughts. She had a gift for listening that made people feel valued, and gradually the Great Hall began to feel less like a military barracks and more like a true family gathering place. It was during one such evening that Kolbrand first noticed the change in his own behavior. He found himself lingering at the evening meal longer than had been his habit, drawn into conversations about subjects he had not considered worthy of discussion for years. The sisters brought perspectives that challenged assumptions he had not realized he held, and their questions often revealed aspects of clan life that he had never examined closely. "Why do the winter festivals focus only on the men's achievements?" Idun asked one evening, her tone curious rather than challenging. "In our father's clan, the women's crafts were celebrated alongside the men's victories." The question led to a discussion that continued long after the meal ended, with clan members sharing traditions from their own backgrounds and discovering similarities and differences that had never been explored. It was the kind of conversation that built understanding and strengthened community bonds, and Kolbrand realized that such discussions had been entirely absent from his household for far too long. But not all the changes were met with universal approval. Some of the younger warriors grumbled about the increased attention paid to domestic affairs, claiming that such focus weakened the clan's martial spirit. A few of the older women whispered about upstart newcomers who sought to change established ways without understanding their importance. Eric Stormcrow remained skeptical, though his objections had grown more subtle since the clan assembly. "Change is not always improvement," he warned Kolbrand during one of their private conferences. "These sisters may bring skills, but they also bring disruption. We should be cautious about altering traditions that have served us well." Yet even Eric could not deny the practical benefits that the sisters' presence had brought to the household. The quality of life had improved in measurable ways, from the excellence of the cloth they produced to the health benefits of Idun's herbal knowledge. The clan's horses had never been in better condition, and the Great Hall had developed an atmosphere of warmth that made the long winter evenings pass more pleasantly. As the first month of the sisters' residence drew to a close, Kolbrand found himself reflecting on the unexpected ways that his impulsive decision had changed not just his household, but his own daily experience of life in Hrafnbrekka. The fortress that had felt like a cold monument to duty and survival was beginning to feel like something warmer, a place where people lived rather than merely endured. The carved wooden chess set had belonged to Kolbrand's father, and his father before him, a testament to the strategic thinking that had kept their bloodline alive through generations of mountain warfare. Each piece was a work of art, carved from different woods to distinguish the opposing forces, dark walnut for one side, pale birch for the other. The king pieces bore the faces of long-dead jarls, while the pawns showed the determined expressions of common warriors whose names were forgotten but whose sacrifice was honored. Kolbrand had not touched the set in years, but something about the sisters' presence in his household had awakened old habits. Perhaps it was the way their questions challenged his assumptions, or their obvious intelligence that seemed to demand more complex engagement than simple conversation could provide. Whatever the reason, he found himself setting up the board one evening, after the Great Hall had mostly emptied. "Do you know this game?" he asked Thora, who had remained by the fire with a piece of mending in her lap. She looked up with interest, setting aside her needle and thread. My father taught me the basics, though I was never skilled at it. Strategy is not about skill, Kolbrand said, gesturing for her to take the seat across from him. It is about understanding patterns and thinking beyond the immediate move. What began as a simple game evolved into something more meaningful over the following evenings. Thora proved to be a quicker learner than her modest assessment suggested, and their matches became exercises in mutual discovery. Through the movements of carved pieces across the checkered board, they learned how each other's mind worked, how they approached problems and balanced risk against reward. "You think like a protector," Kolbrand observed one evening after Thora had sacrificed a powerful piece to safeguard her king. "Always willing to give up advantage to ensure survival of what matters most." "And you think like a warrior," she replied, studying his aggressive positioning. "Seeking victory through decisive action, even when a more cautious approach might serve better." The insights gained through their chess matches began to influence other aspects of their relationship. Kolbrand found himself consulting Thora on household decisions that he had previously made alone, valuing her perspective on matters ranging from resource allocation to personnel disputes. She had a talent for seeing human dynamics that his more direct approach sometimes missed. It was during one of these conversations that a crisis tested their growing partnership. A scout had returned from the lower valleys with troubling news. Several farms had reported missing livestock, and there were signs of organized raiding rather than simple theft by desperate individuals. The tracks suggest a sizable force, the scout reported to Kolbrand and his senior warriors. "Too many horses for bandits, too coordinated for desperate farmers. Someone is testing our defenses." The implications were serious. Winter raiding was uncommon, but not unknown, and it typically signaled larger problems. Either someone was desperate enough to risk winter warfare, or they were probing for weaknesses in anticipation of spring campaigns. Eric Stormcrow advocated for an immediate response. "We should ride out in force, show them that Hrafnbrecker will not tolerate such violations of our territory." But the suggestion troubled Kolbrand. Winter patrols were dangerous, and losing men to storm or accident would weaken the clan more than the livestock raids themselves. Yet, allowing such incursions to continue unopposed would invite escalation. "What does your strategy sense tell you?" he asked Thora that evening as they discussed the situation privately. She considered the question with the same careful attention she brought to their chess games. In chess, when your opponent makes probing moves, you must decide whether they are testing for weakness or preparing for a major attack. The response depends on understanding their true intention. And how do you determine intention when you cannot ask directly? You watch their patterns, you consider what they have to gain and what they risk losing. And sometimes she moved a pawn forward on the board between them. You make them reveal their hand by forcing them to respond to your move. The conversation led to a plan that combined caution with decisive action. Rather than sending out large patrols that might be ambushed or caught by weather, Kolbrand organized smaller, more mobile groups that could track the raiders without engaging directly. The goal was information rather than immediate confrontation. Inga proved invaluable to this strategy. Her understanding of horse behavior allowed her to interpret tracks in ways that provided insights beyond simple direction and numbers. She could determine how recently horses had passed, whether they were being pushed hard or moving at leisure, even whether they carried experienced riders or nervous amateurs. "These horses have been ridden by men who do not know them well," she reported after examining the tracks near one of the raided farms. "See how the hoofprints show uneven wear? The riders are fighting their mounts rather than working with them. These are not the horses of professional cavalry." The information suggested that the raiders might be desperate farmers or dispossessed clansmen rather than organized military forces. This changed the nature of the threat significantly and influenced how Kolbrand chose to respond. Meanwhile, Idun's medical knowledge proved valuable in an unexpected way. One of the patrols had returned with a warrior suffering from exposure after becoming separated from his group during a snowstorm. The man's condition was serious frost damage to his hands and feet that could cost him fingers or toes if not treated properly. Idun worked through the night, using techniques that even Ragnhild had not known, gradually restoring circulation and preventing the permanent damage that mountain dwellers feared above almost all other injuries. Her success not only saved a valuable warrior, but demonstrated medical knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death for anyone living in such harsh conditions. "The girl has gifts that go beyond simple herb lore," Ragnhild told Kolbrand after witnessing Idun's treatment of the exposure victim. "She understands the body's responses to injury in ways that usually take decades to learn." As the crisis with the raiders developed, Kolbrand found himself relying on insights from all three sisters in ways that would have been unthinkable when they first arrived. Their different perspectives and skills had become integral to his decision-making process, and he realized that what had begun as an act of charity had evolved into something that strengthened rather than burdened his household. The wooden chess pieces, carved by craftsmen long dead, continued to facilitate conversations that revealed the growing complexity of relationships within Hrafnbrekka's walls. Each game played out themes of strategy and sacrifice that echoed the larger challenges facing the clan, and each victory or defeat on the checkered board provided insights that informed real-world decisions. Winter was deepening, and with it came the understanding that the sisters' temporary residence was becoming something more permanent and more valuable than anyone had initially imagined. The family medallion lay in Kolbrand's private chamber, wrapped in silk cloth that had protected it for 3 generations. Made of silver, worn smooth by countless hands, it bore the intertwined symbols of his lineage: ravens for wisdom, wolves for loyalty, and the mountain peaks that had sheltered his people since memory began. His father had worn it into battle, as had his grandfather before him, each man carrying the weight of family honor in a piece of metal no larger than a man's palm. Kolbrand had not looked at it since Astrid's death, when the very concept of family had become too painful to contemplate. The medallion represented continuity, the passing of values and traditions from father to son, the building of something larger than any individual life. Without an heir, without even the prospect of one, it had seemed like a monument to failure rather than legacy. But the deep winter brought changes that even he had not anticipated. The isolation that came with the mountain snows had drawn his household closer together in ways that went beyond simple proximity. The Great Hall, once a place where warriors gathered for necessary business, before retreating to their private concerns, had become something resembling a true family space. Evenings now included storytelling sessions where the older warriors shared tales of past campaigns and legendary heroes. Thora had initiated this tradition, but it had quickly grown beyond her original intention. The twins proved to have remarkable memories for detail, often asking questions that led to deeper discussions about the meaning behind familiar stories. "Tell us about the time your father fought the ice bears," Idun would request, and old Magnus would launch into a tale that became richer with each telling, enhanced by the genuine interest of his audience. These sessions revealed aspects of his warriors that Kolbrand had never fully appreciated. Men he had known for decades shared poetry they had composed, demonstrated crafting skills learned in childhood, or spoke about family traditions from their own clans. The household was discovering that survival was about more than martial prowess. It required the full range of human knowledge and creativity. During one particularly memorable evening, Inga had asked about the medallion after noticing Kolbrand wearing it for the first time in years. The question led to a discussion about family symbols and their meaning, which revealed that several clan members carried similar tokens of their heritage. "Each piece tells a story," Thora observed, examining the various medallions, rings, and brooches that emerged from personal collections. Together, they create a larger story about all the families that chose to trust their futures to this place. The observation struck Kolbrand with unexpected force. His medallion was not just about his bloodline, but about his responsibility to all the people who had chosen to follow his leadership. Family, he began to realize, was not merely about blood relations, but about the bonds of mutual protection and shared purpose that held communities together. This expanded understanding of family came at a time when external pressures were mounting. The raiding problem had escalated beyond simple livestock theft. Scouts reported coordinated attacks on multiple settlements, suggesting organization and planning that pointed to larger political motivations rather than desperate hunger. More troubling were the reports from traveling merchants who managed to reach Hrafnbrekka despite the winter conditions. They brought news of clan meetings in the lower valleys, gatherings that excluded Kolbrand's representatives and seemed focused on discussions of changing circumstances and new alliances. They speak of weakness in the high country, one merchant confided to Kolbrand. There are those who question whether the mountain clans can maintain their traditional independence. Eric Stormcrow interpreted this news as confirmation of his worst fears. Your decision to house the additional women has been noted by our rivals, he warned, during a private council session. They see it as evidence that you have become soft, that sentiment now guides your choices rather than practical wisdom. The criticism stung because it contained enough truth to demand serious consideration. Kolbrand's reputation had been built on decisiveness and strength, qualities that discouraged challenges from potential rivals. If that reputation was being questioned, it could invite attacks that might otherwise be avoided. But the winter had also shown him that strength could take forms he had not previously considered. The household's improved morale, the sisters' practical contributions, the sense of genuine community that had developed, these were sources of resilience that pure military might could not provide. The test of these new sources of strength came when a delegation arrived from Jarl Thorson's clan, ostensibly seeking winter shelter, but clearly carrying political messages. The delegation was led by Bjorn Ironside, a warrior whose reputation for ruthlessness was matched only by his political ambition. Lord Kolbrand, Bjorn announced during the formal reception in the Great Hall, "I bring greetings from Jarl Thorson, and an invitation to discuss matters of mutual interest when the spring roads open." The language was diplomatic, but the implications were clear. Jarl Thorson was one of the most powerful leaders in the region, and his invitations typically carried the weight of commands. The fact that he was reaching out during winter suggested urgency that could not wait for normal diplomatic seasons. The Jarl is concerned about the stability of traditional alliances, Bjorn continued, his eyes moving deliberately around the hall to take note of the domestic arrangements that differed from normal clan structures. Recent changes in established practices have created uncertainty about where loyalties lie. The statement was a direct challenge, politely phrased but unmistakable in its meaning. Kolbrand's decision to expand his household was being interpreted as a sign of changing priorities that might affect his reliability as an ally. Thora's presence at his side during this reception had not gone unnoticed by the delegation. Neither had the obvious competence with which she managed the hospitality arrangements or the respectful manner in which the household staff responded to her directions. The twins, too, had been observed as they went about their duties, with the confidence of people who belonged rather than visitors seeking charity. Changes can strengthen as well as weaken, Kolbrand replied carefully, maintaining the diplomatic tone while making clear that he would not be intimidated. Hrafnbrekka remains committed to its traditional alliances, but we also remain committed to our independence in managing our internal affairs. The exchange set the tone for 3 days of careful verbal sparring, with Bjorn probing for weaknesses while Kolbrand demonstrated that his household's changes had enhanced rather than diminished its capabilities. The delegation left without achieving their obvious goal of finding exploitable vulnerabilities, but their visit served as a warning that Kolbrand's choices were being watched and evaluated by forces beyond his mountain stronghold. The leather herb pouch had been Idun's own creation, stitched from duskin during the long winter evenings, and dyed a deep forest green, using techniques she had learned from Ragnhild. But the contents were entirely her own discovery, a collection of mountain plants that she had identified, gathered, and prepared according to methods that combined traditional knowledge with her own careful observations of their properties. Each herb was carefully labeled with symbols she had devised to indicate potency, proper dosage, and specific applications. The pouch contained remedies that had already proven their worth: a treatment for winter fever that worked faster than any traditional cure, a salve for frostbite that had saved fingers and toes, and a preparation that could restore strength to those weakened by the harsh mountain conditions. It was this pouch that had given Idun the confidence to make a proposal that would have seemed unthinkable when she first arrived at Hrafnbrekka. She approached Kolbrand one morning after the household had gathered for the morning meal, her bearing respectful but determined. "Lord Kolbrand," she began, her voice steady despite the obvious importance of what she was about to request, "I would like permission to establish a proper healing house, a place where the sick and injured can receive care without disrupting the Great Hall's daily functions." The request was ambitious beyond anything expected from a young woman who had arrived as little more than a refugee. But the winter had proven that Idun's medical knowledge was not merely theoretical. She had treated everything, from combat injuries to childhood illnesses, with a success rate that impressed even the most skeptical clan members. "The current arrangements work well enough," Eric Stormcrow observed, though his tone lacked its usual edge of dismissal. Even he had been forced to acknowledge Idun's value when she had successfully treated his own bout with winter lung, a condition that had previously required weeks of recovery. "They work," Idun agreed diplomatically, "but they could work better. A dedicated space would allow for proper storage of medicines, isolation of contagious conditions, and the kind of detailed care that promotes faster healing." Kolbrand studied the young woman who had transformed from a frightened refugee into someone confident enough to propose significant changes to his stronghold's organization. The transformation was remarkable, but it was also emblematic of changes that had occurred throughout his household during the deep winter months. Each of the sisters had grown into roles that exceeded their original circumstances. Thora had evolved from the dutiful bride, fulfilling a political arrangement, into a genuine partner whose judgment he valued in matters ranging from household management to clan politics. Her insights during the delegation's visit had proven particularly valuable, as she had noticed subtle signs of deception in Bjorn Ironside's manner that had escaped Kolbrand's attention. Inga had become indispensable to the clan's mounted operations. Her work with the horses had progressed beyond simple care to actual training programs that were producing mounts superior to anything the clan had previously possessed. The young stallion that had once been considered too aggressive for practical use now served as Kolbrand's own war horse, a transformation that had impressed even the most tradition-bound warriors. But it was perhaps Idun's evolution that represented the most dramatic change. The quiet girl who had hidden behind her sister's protection had developed into someone whose medical knowledge was becoming legendary among the mountain clans. Word of her skills had spread beyond Hrafnbrekka, and requests for her services were arriving from neighboring settlements. "The healing house could serve more than our own clan," Thora added, supporting her sister's proposal with the political insight that had become her trademark. "If we establish a reputation for superior medical care, it becomes another form of strength, one that builds alliances rather than requiring military force to maintain them." The observation was astute. In the harsh mountain environment, medical expertise was as valuable as military prowess. A clan known for exceptional healing would attract loyalty from neighbors who might otherwise remain neutral in conflicts or even support rivals. Kolbrand's approval of the Healing House project became another test of his leadership philosophy. Some clan members grumbled about resources being diverted to accommodate the ambitions of newcomers, but the practical benefits were undeniable. and the project proceeded with the same careful planning that characterized all major undertakings at Grafenbrecker. The construction work itself became a community effort that further integrated the sisters into clan life. Warriors accustomed to building defensive fortifications applied their skills to creating a structure designed for healing rather than warfare. The result was a building that combined practical functionality with aesthetic beauty, its windows positioned to maximize natural light, and its interior designed to promote the calm atmosphere that aided recovery. During the construction, disturbing news arrived from the lower valleys. The raiding that had begun as seemingly random livestock theft had escalated into organized attacks on several smaller settlements. More troubling were reports that some of these attacks had been coordinated with inside knowledge, suggesting that traitors within the targeted communities had provided information to the raiders. "It follows a pattern," Kolbrand explained to his senior advisors during a strategy session in his private chamber. "Test the defenses, identify vulnerabilities, then exploit them with precision strikes. This is not the work of desperate farmers or opportunistic bandits." Eric Stormcrow had reached the same conclusion. Someone is building a coalition, using winter raids to weaken potential opposition before the spring campaign season begins. The question is whether we are a target or a potential ally. The answer came in the form of another delegation, this one arriving under circumstances that made their hostile intentions clear. Unlike Bjorn Ironside's diplomatic mission, these visitors made no pretense of seeking shelter or conducting normal clan business. They arrived in full battle gear, their weapons displayed in the manner that announced serious intent. Their leader was Ragnar Bloodeagle, a warrior whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by his effectiveness in battle. His presence at Grafenbrecker could mean only one thing: the preliminary probing was finished, and direct confrontation was about to begin. "Lord Kolbrand," Ragnar announced without any of the usual diplomatic courtesies, "I bring a message from the new alliance of Valley clans. Your isolation has ended. Join us willingly, or be forced to join us through conquest." The ultimatum was delivered in the Great Hall before the entire household, a deliberate insult designed to demonstrate that Kolbrand's previous position of strength was no longer respected. But as Ragnar spoke, Kolbrand found himself surrounded by people whose loyalty had been earned through months of shared challenges and mutual respect. The sisters stood with him not as refugees seeking protection, but as valued clan members whose own futures were threatened by the alliance's demands. The household that had once been a collection of individual warriors bound only by duty had become something stronger, a true community willing to fight for the right to determine their own destiny. The hidden letters had been discovered by accident, tucked behind a loose stone in Eric Stormcrow's private chamber when repairs were being made to wind damage from the last blizzard. Thora had been the one to find them, her hand brushing against the folded parchments while checking for structural damage. What she read in those carefully concealed documents would shatter every assumption about her marriage, her sister's situation, and the true nature of the threats facing Grafenbrecker. The correspondence was extensive, spanning months of secret communication between Eric Stormcrow and representatives of Jarl Thorson's clan. Each letter revealed another layer of a conspiracy that made Thora's blood run cold as she comprehended the full scope of the deception that had shaped her life. The first letter, dated weeks before her marriage arrangement had been finalized, laid out the trap with brutal clarity. "The giant has grown too, comfortable in his mountain stronghold. His reputation for strength serves our enemy's purposes, but it also makes direct confrontation costly. Better to weaken him through seemingly generous acts that will be interpreted as evidence of softening resolve." The marriage arrangement, Thora realized with growing horror, had never been intended as a genuine alliance. It was the opening move in a campaign designed to destroy Kolbrand's reputation and political position through manipulation rather than military force. The bride comes from a desperate clan. Her father's debts ensure cooperation. More importantly, she brings additional burdens that the marriage contract does not require Kolbrand to accept. When he rejects the extra sisters, as any reasonable lord must do, the bride will be shamed and the alliance will collapse in acrimony. This will demonstrate his callousness to potential allies while creating justification for intervention to protect the innocent. But the conspiracy had a backup plan for the possibility that Kolbrand might surprise them by accepting the sisters, a possibility that the conspirators had considered unlikely but not impossible. Should the giant's sentimentality overcome his judgment and he accept the additional burden, it will serve our purposes even better. Feeding 3 women through the winter instead of 1 will strain his resources and create resentment among his own people. More importantly, it will be seen by other clans as evidence that emotion now governs his decisions rather than practical wisdom. A leader guided by sentiment rather than strength becomes vulnerable to challenges that would never be attempted against one known for decisive action. The letters revealed that Eric Stormcrow had been reporting regularly on the household's internal dynamics, providing detailed intelligence about the sisters' integration and the clan's reactions to their presence. Every conversation, every private moment, every sign of growing affection between Kolbrand and his new family had been catalogued and transmitted to enemies who planned to use such information as weapons. The sisters have proven more useful than anticipated, one later letter read. The eldest shows political acumen that could strengthen rather than weaken the giant's position if allowed to develop. Recommend acceleration of the timeline before their influence becomes too established. Thora felt physically sick as she read Eric's clinical assessment of her own growing relationship with Kolbrand, her sister's contributions to the clan's welfare, and the ways that their presence might actually be strengthening rather than weakening Grafenbrecker's position. The conspiracy had expected to exploit Kolbrand's mercy as weakness, but when mercy had proven to create strength, the conspirators had simply adjusted their plans to eliminate what they could not corrupt. The most recent letters revealed the current phase of the plot with devastating clarity. The winter raids had not been random acts of desperation, but carefully orchestrated attacks designed to create the impression of widespread instability that would justify outside intervention. The Alliance is prepared to move when the spring roads open. Preliminary raids have created sufficient pretext for protective action. The giant's reputation for isolated strength becomes a liability when presented as a threat to regional stability rather than an asset to regional security. But it was the final letter that revealed the true scope of the B-team: betrayal. Eric Stormcrow had not merely been reporting intelligence to enemies, he had been actively sabotaging Grafenbrecker's defenses and relationships with potential allies. The northern watchtowers have been compromised as discussed. Sentries loyal to us will ensure that any spring offensive encounters minimal early warning. Additionally, the grain stores have been gradually reduced through necessary emergency distributions to create the food shortages that will justify claims of the giant's poor leadership when the crisis peaks. The systematic nature of the betrayal was breathtaking in its scope. Eric had spent years positioning himself as Kolbrand's most trusted advisor, while simultaneously undermining every aspect of the stronghold's security and prosperity. The food shortages that had been used to argue against accepting the sisters had been artificially created. The intelligence about enemy movements had been deliberately delayed or distorted. Even the marriage arrangement itself had been shaped by Eric's recommendations to his unsuspecting lord. Thora's hands shook as she read the final lines of the most recent letter. The spring offensive will succeed because the giant believes his strength lies in the loyalty of his people. He cannot conceive that his closest advisor serves other interests. When the attack comes, it will find a stronghold already weakened from within by those he trusts most. The sisters will be useful hostages to ensure his complete cooperation with the new order. The implications crashed over Thora like an avalanche. She and her sisters had been innocent pawns in a game designed to destroy the man who had shown them unexpected kindness. Worse, their continued presence had provided cover for Eric's activities, as his apparent concern about their burden on the clan's resources had deflected suspicion from his actual role in creating those resource problems. She thought of Kolbrand's quiet confidence in Eric's advice, his willingness to discuss sensitive matters in front of someone he considered absolutely trustworthy. Every conversation about defensive preparations, every discussion of alliance possibilities, every moment of vulnerability had been immediately transmitted to enemies who would use such knowledge to devastating effect. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside Eric's chamber sent panic through Thora's mind. If she were discovered reading these letters, not only would her life be forfeit, but any chance of warning Kolbrand about the conspiracy would be lost. Moving quickly but carefully, she replaced the letters exactly as she had found them, ensuring that the loose stone was positioned to conceal the hiding place perfectly. Her mind raced as she made her way back to her own chambers. The spring offensive was apparently planned to begin soon after the roads became passable, which meant she had perhaps weeks to find a way to expose Eric's treachery without triggering immediate retaliation. The conspirators clearly considered the sisters valuable as hostages, which meant that revealing the plot prematurely could result in their being used as leverage against Kolbrand. But the greatest challenge was finding a way to convince Kolbrand that his most trusted advisor was actually his greatest enemy. Eric's position had been built over years of apparently loyal service, and his advice had often proven sound not because he was genuinely loyal, but because undermining Kolbrand's position required maintaining credibility until the crucial moment. As Thora sat in her chamber that evening, listening to her sister's quiet conversation by the firelight, she realized that the choice Kolbrand had made to accept them into his household had been even more significant than anyone had imagined. What had seemed like simple mercy had actually been an act of defiance against a conspiracy designed to destroy everything he had built. The question now was whether that act of defiance had given them enough strength to survive the trap that was about to spring closed around them all. The war banner of Grafenbrecher had not been raised in 15 years, its ancient wool and leather carefully preserved in the stronghold's armory like a sleeping beast waiting for the call to battle. The banner bore the symbols of Kolbrand's lineage, the mountain peaks, the raven, and the crossed war hammers, woven in threads that had been dyed with pigments gathered from the sacred places of his ancestors. When raised, it would call every sworn warrior within a day's ride to prepare for war, a signal that could not be ignored or mistaken. But before that banner could fly above Grafenbrecher's walls, Thora faced the delicate task of exposing Eric Stormcrow's treachery without triggering the immediate retaliation that the letters had made clear was planned for anyone who discovered the conspiracy. She chose her moment carefully, waiting until Eric was occupied with inspecting the outer defenses, an ironic task, given that he was simultaneously undermining them. Approaching Kolbrand in his private study, she carried with her one of the original letters, the one that laid out the marriage arrangement's true purpose in the most damning terms. "My lord," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal, "I have discovered something that you must see, though it will bring you pain to learn of it." Kolbrand looked up from the tactical maps he had been studying, his expression shifting to concern as he noted the serious tone of her voice and the formal manner of her address. "What troubles you?" Without speaking, Thora placed the letter before him on the table, positioning it so that the seal and signature were clearly visible. She watched his face as he read, seeing the progression from confusion to disbelief to a cold anger that made the very air in the chamber seem to grow heavier. When he finished reading, Kolbrand set the parchment down with deliberate care, as if it might explode from rough handling. "Where did you find this?" Thora explained the circumstances of her discovery, watching as Kolbrand's expression darkened further with each detail. The betrayal was complete, not just the conspiracy against his leadership, but the manipulation of his personal relationships and the deliberate endangerment of innocent people for political advantage. How many others have you read? Enough to understand the scope of the plot. The spring offensive, the compromised watchtowers, the artificial food shortages, all of it orchestrated by someone you trusted above all others. Kolbrand was silent for a long moment, his powerful hands clenched into fists as he absorbed the implications of what he had learned. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the controlled fury of a man who had been betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. Eric has been my advisor for 20 years. He stood beside me when Astrid died. He helped me build this stronghold stone by stone. The idea that he could... He stopped, unable to finish the thought. The letters make clear that this betrayal has been years in the making, Thora said gently. He has been playing a long game, building trust specifically so that he could destroy you more completely when the moment came. The revelation forced immediate action, despite the dangers involved. Every day that Eric remained in position provided him with opportunities to gather intelligence, sabotage defenses, or trigger early phases of the conspiracy. But confronting him directly would alert the broader network of traitors and potentially precipitate the very crisis they hoped to prevent. Kolbrand's solution demonstrated the strategic thinking that had made him a successful military leader. Rather than dramatic confrontation, he chose careful observation and gradual isolation of the threat. "We will watch him," Kolbrand decided. "Let him believe his secret is safe while we identify his other allies within our own walls." A conspiracy this extensive cannot depend on a single agent. The plan required exceptional discipline from everyone who knew the truth. Kolbrand continued to consult Eric on defensive preparations while secretly implementing different strategies based on intelligence that Eric was not privy to. Thora maintained her normal interactions with the household while carefully observing who seemed unusually interested in the sisters' activities or uncommonly concerned about their continued presence. Inga and Idun were brought into the secret when their own observations provided crucial intelligence. Inga had noticed that certain warriors seemed reluctant to discuss patrol routes in Eric's presence, behavior that suggested some level of awareness about compromised security. Idun had observed unusual patterns in requests for medical supplies that coincided with Eric's private meetings, suggesting coordination between the conspiracy and planned disruptions of the clan's health and welfare. "We are not the only ones who have begun to suspect," Inga reported after carefully sounding out the stablemaster about his concerns. Henrik mentioned that some of the horses assigned to perimeter patrols have been returning with signs of harder riding than their reported routes should require. "Someone has been using our own mounts for unauthorized activities." The discovery prompted a comprehensive review of the stronghold's security that revealed the full extent of Eric's sabotage. The northern watchtowers had indeed been compromised, with sentries loyal to the conspiracy positioned to provide inadequate warning of approaching threats. The grain stores showed signs of systematic theft disguised as legitimate distributions to neighboring settlements. Even the weapons maintenance schedule had been altered to ensure that critical equipment would be in poor condition when the offensive began. "He has been thorough," Kolbrand admitted grimly as the scope of the betrayal became clear. "If we had not discovered the letters, the spring offensive would have found us weakened in every way that matters." But the discovery also revealed the conspiracy's greatest weakness. Eric's network depended on the assumption that their activities would remain undetected until the crucial moment. Once exposed, many of the conspirators proved to be reluctant participants who had been coerced through debt or blackmail rather than genuine converts to the cause. The process of quietly identifying and neutralizing the internal threats required weeks of careful investigation. Each suspected conspirator had to be tested without alerting others to the fact that the plot had been discovered. Some were approached directly and offered choices between redemption and exile. Others were gradually isolated from sensitive information and duties until they could be dealt with more permanently. Throughout this delicate process, the sisters proved invaluable in ways that the original conspirators had never anticipated. Thora's political insights helped identify which clan members were genuinely loyal versus those whose support might waver under pressure. Inga's knowledge of the stronghold's daily routines revealed discrepancies that pointed to unauthorized activities. Idun's medical training allowed her to identify signs of stress and deception in people who were trying to maintain false loyalty while serving enemy interests. "They planned to use us as weapons against you," Thora observed during one of their evening strategy sessions. "Instead, we have become your strongest assets in defending against their plot." The irony was not lost on Kolbrand. The mercy he had shown in accepting the sisters, which was supposed to be evidence of weakening judgment, had instead provided him with precisely the allies he needed to counter a threat that conventional military strength could not address. As the winter began its slow retreat toward spring, the preparations for confrontation took on increasing urgency. The war banner remained furled, but the weapons were sharpened and the defenses strengthened with modifications that Eric was not aware of. Loyal warriors were positioned to counter the compromised sentries when the moment of betrayal finally arrived. But perhaps most importantly, the household had developed the kind of unity and shared purpose that would be essential for surviving the trials ahead. The conspiracy had been designed to exploit divisions and weaknesses within Hrafnbrekke's walls. Instead, the process of uncovering and countering the plot had created bonds of trust and mutual dependence that made the stronghold stronger than it had ever been. When the spring thaw finally began and the war banner was raised above Hrafnbrekke's walls, it would fly over a community that had been tested by betrayal and found its strength not in isolation, but in the courage to protect what they had chosen to build together. The signal horn had been carved from the tusk of a great mountain elk by Kolbrand's grandfather, its surface etched with runes that promised aid to those brave enough to sound it in their darkest hour. The horn's deep, resonant voice could carry across valleys and through mountain passes, reaching settlements that might otherwise remain unaware of approaching danger. For generations it had hung silent in the Great Hall, a symbol of community bonds that transcended individual clan boundaries. The attack came with the dawn, just as the conspiracy's letters had predicted. But instead of finding a stronghold weakened by internal division and compromised defenses, the assault force encountered a fortress that had used the winter months to prepare for exactly this kind of coordinated offensive. Eric Stormcrow had positioned himself on the walls as planned, ready to signal the attackers when the compromised sentries failed to raise adequate alarm. But the sentries he expected to betray their posts had been quietly replaced weeks earlier, and the signals he sent were observed by loyal warriors who had been watching him carefully since Thora's discovery of the letters. "Now," Kolbrand commanded, and Eric found himself surrounded by men who had served alongside him for years, but whose loyalty to their lord proved stronger than any conspiracy could corrupt. The betrayal's exposure sent shockwaves through the attacking force, which had counted on inside assistance to overcome Hrafnbrekke's natural defensive advantages. Instead of finding gates left conveniently unbarred and watchtowers mysteriously silent, they encountered a coordinated defense that had anticipated their every tactical advantage. Inga's work with the horses proved crucial in these opening moments. The mounts that carried Kolbrand's scouts and messengers responded to her training with speed and agility that allowed rapid communication between defensive positions. Her understanding of the attackers' horses also provided tactical intelligence she could determine from their movement patterns, which units were experienced cavalry and which were mounted infantry unfamiliar with their animals. "The eastern group is having trouble with their mounts," she reported to Kolbrand as they watched the assault develop from the Great Hall's windows. "They're fighting their horses instead of working with them. If we can force them to maneuver quickly, they'll lose formation." The observation led to a tactical decision that exploited the attacker's weakness. Rather than meeting the assault with static defense, Kolbrand ordered selective sorties that forced the enemy cavalry to respond rapidly to threats from unexpected directions. As Inga had predicted, the unfamiliar riders quickly lost cohesion when their mounts proved difficult to control under pressure. Idun's medical preparations proved equally valuable as the battle developed. She had spent weeks creating stockpiles of treatments specifically designed for combat injuries, and her healing house became a crucial component of the stronghold's ability to maintain fighting strength. Warriors who might otherwise have been lost to blood loss or shock returned to the walls after receiving her expert care. The mountain fever remedy works even better on battle wounds than I expected, she reported during a brief lull in the fighting. The same properties that fight infection and restore strength make it possible for injured men to continue fighting when they would normally be incapacitated. But it was Thora's contribution that perhaps proved most crucial to the defense's success. Her political insights had allowed the identification of potential allies among neighboring clans who had been approached by the conspiracy but had chosen to remain neutral rather than join the offensive. The signal horn, when sounded at the critical moment, reached these uncommitted communities with a call for aid that they were prepared to answer. The horn's voice rolled across the mountain valleys like thunder, carrying with it centuries of tradition that honored mutual assistance in times of desperate need. Within hours, warriors from 3 neighboring clans were riding hard toward Grafenbrekke, drawn by bonds of community that the conspiracy had underestimated. The first wave of the assault broke against defenses that proved far stronger than anticipated. The attackers had expected to face a weakened stronghold, divided by internal conflict and compromised by treachery. Instead, they encountered a united community that had been strengthened by the very challenges that were supposed to have weakened it. Kolbrand himself fought with the controlled fury of a man defending everything that mattered to him. His warhammer, the same weapon that had earned him his reputation decades earlier, struck with precision that turned individual combat into deadly art. But more importantly, his presence on the walls inspired a level of determination that transformed ordinary clansmen into warriors willing to face overwhelming odds. As the sun reached its zenith and the first wave of attackers retreated to regroup, the defenders had reason for cautious optimism. The conspiracy's internal advantages had been neutralized, the tactical surprises had failed to materialize, and help was coming from unexpected quarters. But the celebration was premature. The retreating attackers were not defeated. They were regrouping for a second assault, with the full knowledge that their carefully laid plans had been discovered and countered. The next attack would come with desperate fury, as men who had staked everything on victory realized that failure meant not just defeat, but complete destruction. The unity braid had been woven by the 3 sisters during one of their quiet evenings by the fire, combining threads of different colors and textures into a rope that symbolized their unbreakable bond. Thora's thread was deep blue like mountain lakes, Inga's was forest green like summer meadows, and Idun's was golden yellow like autumn grain. Together, the colors created something beautiful and strong, a physical reminder that their different strengths were greater when combined than when standing alone. Now that same braid hung from Thora's belt as she stood on Grafenbrekke's walls, watching the enemy prepare for their final, desperate assault. The first attack had failed, but it had also revealed the true size of the force arrayed against them. What had seemed like a manageable threat in the morning had grown throughout the day as additional units arrived from the conspiracy's allied clans. The second assault came with the fury of men who knew that failure meant destruction. Having lost the advantages of surprise and internal betrayal, the attackers compensated with overwhelming numbers and reckless aggression. Wave after wave of warriors threw themselves against the stronghold's defenses, each assault more desperate than the last. It was during this chaotic battle that Eric Stormcrow made his final play for victory. Overpowering the guards who held him, he broke free and made a desperate run toward the main gate, intending to open it for the attackers who waited just beyond the walls. His years of service had given him intimate knowledge of every passage and weakness in Grafenbrekke's defences, and he used that knowledge now in service of its destruction. But he had not counted on the sisters. Inga intercepted him first, using her intimate knowledge of the stronghold's layout to cut off his escape route. Though she lacked the physical strength to stop a veteran warrior in direct combat, her understanding of defensive positions allowed her to force him toward the great hall where help would be available. Idun was waiting there with medical supplies that included more than healing herbs. Among her carefully prepared materials were substances that could incapacitate as well as cure, and she used them now with the precision that had made her legendary among the mountain clans. "Sleep powder mixed with mountain mint," she explained calmly as Eric collapsed, his treacherous sprint ending in unconsciousness rather than the gates opening. "He will wake with nothing worse than a severe headache, which is more mercy than he showed any of us." Thora's role in stopping Eric was more subtle, but no less crucial. She had positioned the household's most trusted warriors at key locations throughout the stronghold, creating a network of loyal defenders who could respond quickly to internal threats. When Eric broke free, he found his path blocked at every turn by people who had been warned to watch for exactly such an attempt. But the real test came when the external assault reached its climax. The attackers had concentrated their remaining strength into a single, overwhelming push that threatened to breach the main defenses through sheer weight of numbers. The walls that had seemed impregnable in the morning now groaned under pressure that tested every stone and timber. It was then that the unity braid proved its symbolic power. As the battle reached its crisis point, the three sisters worked together with the coordination they had developed over months of shared challenges. Inga coordinated the movement of reserves using her knowledge of horse and human psychology. Idun treated the wounded with efficiency that kept fighting men in action when they should have been incapacitated. Thora organized the household's non-combatants into support roles that freed experienced warriors for frontline duties. Their combined efforts created a defensive response that exceeded the sum of its parts. Where individual courage might have failed under overwhelming pressure, coordinated action maintained resistance that the attackers could not break. The three women who had arrived as refugees had become the heart of a community's determination to survive. The turning point came when the allied clans, summoned by the signal horn, finally arrived in force. The warriors who rode to Grafenbrekke's aid were not just responding to a call for help. They were defending the principle that communities should be free to choose their own path, rather than submit to conquest through treachery. The arrival of these reinforcements coincided with the attackers' final desperate assault on the main gate. Instead of finding the stronghold's defenses finally broken, the assault force found themselves caught between the fortress walls and fresh enemies approaching from behind. The conspiracy's forces, already exhausted by hours of futile attacks against prepared positions, could not withstand this new pressure. The alliance that had seemed so formidable in planning disintegrated under the reality of unified resistance from communities that refused to be intimidated or manipulated. Ragnar Blood Eagle, who had led the assault with the confidence of someone certain of victory, found himself surrounded and facing the same choice he had offered: Kolbrand surrender willingly or be forced to surrender through defeat. The unity braid, woven from 3 different threads but stronger than any single strand, had become a symbol realized in the victory of a community that had chosen cooperation over conquest, mercy over ruthlessness, and family bonds over blood vengeance. The new family seal had been carved during the first weeks of spring, when the mountain passes had cleared enough for skilled artisans to travel between the clans. The stone bore symbols that would have been unthinkable when winter began. Kolbrand's traditional ravens and mountain peaks now intertwined with new designs that represented each of the sisters. Thora's contribution was shown through interlaced knots, symbolizing the bonds that hold families together. Inga's mark appeared as horses running free across mountain meadows. Idun's symbol was a flowering herb, representing healing and growth. Together, the carved elements created something unprecedented in clan tradition, a family seal that acknowledged chosen bonds as equal to those of blood, that celebrated the strength that came from unity rather than dominance. The seal would be used on official documents, pressed into wax for important correspondence, and displayed in the Great Hall as a permanent reminder of how three refugee sisters had transformed a warrior's isolated stronghold into something resembling a true home. The victory over Ragnar Bloodeagle's conspiracy had consequences that rippled across the mountain region for months after the battle. The alliance of clans that had responded to Hrafnbrekka's call for aid remained strong, bound together by the shared recognition that their independence depended on mutual support rather than individual strength. Other communities that had been pressured to join the conspiracy found themselves free to chart their own courses without fear of retaliation. Eric Stormcrow's fate had been decided by clan law rather than personal vengeance. Given the opportunity to confess his crimes publicly and provide information about the broader conspiracy, he chose exile over execution, a mercy that surprised many, but reflected Kolbrand's determination to build rather than destroy whenever possible. The former advisor departed with nothing but the clothes on his back and the knowledge that his name would be remembered as a cautionary tale about the price of betrayal. The healing house that Idun had proposed during the winter became reality in the weeks following the battle. Constructed with help from the allied clans, it represented more than medical advancement. It was a symbol of communities working together to create something beneficial for all. Idun's reputation as a healer had grown beyond the mountain region, and people traveled considerable distances to seek treatment that combined traditional knowledge with her innovative techniques. She saved more lives during the battle than any warrior's sword, Kolbrand observed to Thora as they watched Idun training apprentices from 3 different clans in the new facility. Yet her greatest achievement may be teaching others that healing is as valuable as fighting. Inga's work with horses had evolved into a training program that served multiple clans, sharing knowledge that had previously been hoarded by individual communities. The improved mounts that resulted from her methods became symbols of cooperation rather than competition, as neighboring clans discovered that sharing expertise created advantages for everyone involved. The loom in the women's quarter hummed with activity as Thora expanded the textile work into a cooperative venture that included women from allied communities. The patterns they created told stories of friendship and mutual aid, and the cloth they produced was traded throughout the region as examples of what skilled hands could accomplish when working toward common goals. But perhaps the most significant change was in the Great Hall itself. The evening gatherings that had begun as simple necessity had evolved into celebrations of community that drew visitors from across the mountain region. The hall that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with laughter and conversation that bridged differences of clan and custom. Kolbrand found himself at the center of these gatherings, not as a distant lord dispensing wisdom from above, but as a member of a community that valued his strength while also appreciating the gentler qualities that the sisters had helped him rediscover. The marriage that had begun as political convenience had developed into partnership that enhanced both participants while creating something larger than either could achieve alone. "Do you ever regret it?" Thora asked him one evening as they sat by the fire, watching Inga demonstrate horse training techniques to fascinated children while Idun explained the properties of healing herbs to their parents. "The choice to keep us when it would have been easier to send us away?" Kolbrand considered the question while studying the scene around them. The Great Hall was full of people whose loyalty had been earned rather than inherited, whose presence created warmth that no amount of wealth or military power could purchase. The sisters, who had arrived as burdens, had become the foundation of a community that was stronger, wiser, and more resilient than anything he had built through force alone. "I regret many things," he said finally, his arm tightening around her shoulders. Battles I fought for the wrong reasons, chances for peace I missed because of pride, years spent believing that strength meant standing alone, but bringing you and your sisters into my life. That choice gave me back something I thought was lost forever. Outside, spring rain drummed against the mountain stone, washing away the last traces of the winter that had changed so many lives. The sound was peaceful rather than threatening, a reminder that even storms passed, and that growth often followed the harshest seasons. The new family seal gleamed in the firelight, its carved symbols catching and reflecting the dancing flames. In the morning, there would be decisions to make about alliances and trade agreements, training programs to oversee, and the countless details of managing a community that had grown far beyond its original boundaries. But tonight, in the warmth of the great hall, surrounded by people who had chosen to build something together rather than tear things apart, the past seemed less important than the future they were creating. The three sisters, who had stepped down from a wagon in the snow, had found their place in a story that was still being written, and their presence ensured that it would be a tale worth telling for generations to come. Sometimes the hardest choices in life truly are the ones that define who we are, and sometimes, if we are very fortunate, they define us as people capable of love, mercy, and the courage to protect what matters most.